Hello, everybody. It is a minute or two past the hour of 12. So good afternoon. Welcome to today's event, which is the launch of our latest report, Climbing the Summit, which looks at the performance of big cities in the UK and in other G7 countries. As we all know, because we've been avidly watching the general election conversations, the need for more economic growth has been a constant refrain that we've heard from politicians of all stripes, or at least nearly all stripes. And the reason for that is obviously because, for its own sake, because we don't have very much economic growth in the country at the moment, but also because if we get more economic growth, as we're told by our politicians, that creates revenues, which then can be spent on the public services that everybody wants, needs, and expects. And specifically, I think the Labour Party have said they want to, in the UK, they want the UK to achieve the highest sustained growth in the G7, with more detail to come undoubtedly tomorrow when they launch their manifesto. Well, I think it's fair to say, particularly for those of us that operate in the sort of subnational field for much of the time, that much of the economic growth conversation is national in orientation. And secondly, doesn't really take into consideration the geography aspect. And I think that's part of the issue. So where economic growth can happen, does happen, should happen, and what the policy offer is needed in order to make that happen. So if we think and care about the geographical aspects of growth, then thinking about the corresponding policy offer is quite critical, and it will be complementary but slightly different from some of the policies that we're going to need to stimulate and support national economic growth. And obviously that's very much the remit of the Centre for Cities, is to try and plug that gap. So today's report is the latest in a big body of work that we do and have been doing and will continue to do, that sets out the role, the contribution, the potential of Britain's big cities to increasing local, regional and national prosperity. And in a minute, my colleague Anthony Breach, who is a co-author of the report Climbing the Summit, along with my other colleague Paul Swinney, is going to set out the main findings, the main details of the report. So looking at what we did, what we found, and the implications of what we found for policy. He'll use loads of slides with lots of data. That'll take about 25 minutes. And then we'll open it up for a conversation, a bit of a Q&A, take your comments. So as always with us, use the Q&A function to stick your questions in for us or your comments. And in due course, we'll get to them. But without further ado, Ant, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Let's see if we can get this presentation up and running. Can we all see that? Yes, terrific. All right, thank you everyone for coming today. So here to talk through and introduce our latest report, Climbing the Summit, big cities in the UK and the G7. So really it's looking at, what is the role of the big cities in national economic strategy? So how do they compare to their peers in the G7, but also trying to use that to explain patterns in the national economy and come up with solutions on how to improve it. So let's see, is this working? Yes. So I think the first thing to say is that the idea for this report came from us noticing that politicians and the media really like to make comparisons with the G7 to communicate ideas about the economy. So you can see here we've got both from Labour and the Conservatives. We've got Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves here looking very happy at the promise of achieving the highest sustained growth in the G7. So that's one of the objectives for their economic mission on delivering economic stability and growth over their promise in government. But conversely, you can also see the Conservatives recently saying that because we've got the UK's had the joint fastest growth in the G7, the economic strategy of the current government is working, it's successful, and that's actually why we should stay the course. So we notice two problems with this kind of debate. One is that these comparisons are often very short term, driven by statistical releases. So in fact, today we're discussing, the economic performance of the UK in the month of April has not been very successful. That's not really a great foundation on which to build a kind of long-term economic strategy, kind of month by month growth records. But also, as Andrew said, this is national only. So, while it does make sense, to obviously, in one level, to compare between different countries in the G7, we do know that cities and local economies are really important to national economic growth. There's currently a bit of a gap in trying to understand how different economies across the G7 are performing. And this matters, right? So this is, if you then go on beneath the differences in rates of change, and instead look at the levels of productivity of kind of constant month by month, year by year performance, you can see that there's a really, really big prosperity gap between the UK and the leading economies of the G7. So this chart is showing output per worker, productivity between the G7 countries with the different types of economic geography marked in different colors. So we've marked in dark green our primary city. So this is the city that makes the largest contribution to GDP in each country. It's not the biggest in every country except Germany, but obviously in the UK, that's London. We've got the secondary cities. So that includes all of the large cities in each country that are the size of Nottingham or larger. So that's in the UK, that's Manchester, Birmingham, kind of the West Yorkshire region. That's Sheffield, Newcastle, Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow. And then there's the rest of the country, which includes smaller cities and kind of rural areas as well. And there's kind of two things to notice from this chart. The first is that the UK is quite some way behind in terms of productivity at a national level. I think it can be quite clearly shown from the chart relative to our true peers, France and Germany, but also that those leading countries in the G7, so the United States, France, Germany, kind of arguably Italy in this sense, all have quite a defined economic hierarchy of cities in which the primary city and the most important kind of city in each country's economy is the most productive. The secondary cities, the other large urban areas, are not as productive, but still kind of helping lead the national economy. And then the rest of the country is some way behind in terms of productivity performance. In contrast, kind of the laggards within the G7, so Canada, Japan, and the UK, all have a kind of more kind of varied economic geography. Perhaps in Canada's case, this is due to their reliance on oil, but really you can see in the UK that we have a kind of quite strange pattern where London is extremely productive, as productive as Munich, as productive as Paris, but in our secondary cities are really much less productive than their peers elsewhere in the G7 and much less productive than anywhere else in the country. And the scale of this really matters, right? So, looking at, if you think about what would need to happen for the UK to catch up with France and Germany, which is what this table is showing, it'd be a big increase in total GDP, about 181 billion pounds every year. Both London, the secondary cities, and the rest of the UK would need to see their output improve to catch up with that. But if you can see on the final column there on the right, actually it's the secondary cities that are seeing by far the biggest increase in their output as a share of the increase needed. So the big cities outside London would contribute 57% of the total catch-up between France and Germany if we were to become as rich as our leading G7 countries, with London contributing an extra 25%. So our analysis from this is that it's possible for the UK to become as rich as Germany, but it's really not possible to do that without fixing these underlying problems in our big cities outside London. So why do we experience these problems? What's actually going on in our big cities that's really quite different to our peers in the G7? Well, so the underlying key thing is that agglomeration, this kind of phenomenon where as cities become larger, they become more productive, doesn't really seem to work in the UK outside London currently. So what we've got here is a chart showing population on the bottom axis and productivity on the vertical axis. And you can see there's quite a nice slope where generally kind of the larger each cities become, both within countries and across the G7, the more productive they become. But we don't really see that in our secondary cities marked in purple here on the chart outside of London, right? So places like Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield, these are places as productive as kind of either cities in the former East Germany, so places like Dresden or Leipzig, or in kind of southern Italy, a famously poor part of the G7, places like Palermo or Naples. But crucially, unlike Germany or Italy, both of which have numerous cities outside of these regions which are prosperous and which are successful, the UK has this dynamic where only London is really performing according to the trend, and really all of our large cities outside the capital are experiencing some form of dysfunction. To the extent that of the 112 cities in the G7, bigger than Nottingham, of the bottom 20 of those, 7 are British. So, I think it's then kind of worth trying to unpack this and trying to understand, well, why is it that agglomeration is not really working? How can we get that to work and function a bit better inside UK big cities? Well, it seems to be that if you look into kind of the nature of the labour market in our G7, in our big cities in the UK, across the G7, really something that seems to be quite closely linked to productivity performance is the number of knowledge-intensive services within each city. So these are jobs like marketing, like software, like finance, like publishing, graphic design, highly knowledge-intensive work that is highly productive and really prizes having the benefits of urban areas and having a large number of high-skilled workers to recruit from and to then sell to markets elsewhere. So this is a national comparative advantage of the UK. So it's alongside the United States. It's one of the things we are really good at as a country. But and it's something that, again, across the G7, this is closely linked to productivity. But we can see that our big cities outside of London really don't have that much more KIBs than a lot of their peers. If anything, they're kind of trending towards the bottom of the pack near Japanese cities, but also that they're all consistently below the trend line in terms of productivity. So there's both a quantity problem, but also a quality problem in terms of our knowledge-intensive services. So, I think we can kind of contrast a little bit this a bit with manufacturing, and potentially might kind of upset people at this point. But if you look across the G7, you don't quite see the same relationship between manufacturing and productivity that you do see with knowledge-intensive services. And this partly seems to be the fact that manufacturing doesn't have quite the same relationship to the benefits of cities, which offer lots of highly skilled workers, despite the cost of congestion and expensive land within their local economies. This isn't saying that manufacturing isn't important to national economies or that it's not important to other local economies outside of the big cities. But what this really suggests is that manufacturing probably isn't that important a route to improving the national economy via improving the performance of the big cities. So again, kind of taking a step back and trying to think about, so if it's the case that our big cities in the UK are really struggling to offer attractive benefits to knowledge-intensive work and knowledge-intensive investment across the entire G7, what are some of the reasons why our big cities might be experiencing that problem? I think if you look at kind of what the key ask of knowledge-intensive firms and investment is, really it's about how many graduates can access the city centre within a reasonable commute. This kind of work needs a large pool of highly skilled workers to recruit from, to get tight specialization and to achieve better matching, to share ideas, to benefit from knowledge spillovers between workers and firms within a very, very small distance of operation. And the investment will flow to places and cities that can offer those benefits to that type of work. I mean, we've come up with a bit of a kind of an analogy here. You can think about almost cities as almost like a computer to sort of try and investigate, what are the potential reasons that different cities might offer benefits to knowledge-intensive work in greater or lesser amounts. And we can talk about the software of cities. So what's the skills base? What's the accumulated knowledge of their workers? How attractive is that to these knowledge-intensive firms? What is the hardware of these cities? How does the built environment and the urban transport infrastructure determine how many graduates can access the city centre within a reasonable commute? But also kind of what's the operator of the cities? What are the institutions? What are the incentives and purpose of local government in running these big local economies? Do they experience rewards in terms of increased tax revenues from growing their local economy? Do they have the powers and resources to be able to change their local economy to to develop this kind of work and attract in? this kind of investment. If we go for each of these in turn, first software, then hardware, and then operator. So if we look at skills first, you can see in some ways it's a bit of a mixed picture on skills for the UK big cities. So while we do have a bit of a problem with quite considerable number of low-skilled workers, so more than most G7 peers, but less than Italy and Japan, that's really a factor of how polarized the UK skills market is. So we actually have quite a few low-skilled workers, but also a considerable number of high-skilled workers as well. We're actually quite middle of the pack, as you can see from this chart on the vertical axis in terms of number of high-skilled workers in G7 cities. But this chart showing that plotted against the share of jobs in knowledge-intensive services on the horizontal axis indicates that even though our cities are quite highly skilled, they have a large number of graduates in their urban areas, they don't quite have as many knowledge-intensive jobs as we would expect them to. So you've got cities such as Marseille, Lyon, Toulouse, Frankfurt, Dusseldorf, even Detroit. These are all places that have less or kind of comparable levels of graduates as to what a lot of our big cities outside of London all have. But they all have considerably more kind of knowledge-intensive services jobs than what our big cities have. So, even though we've kind of got the software, not completely right, if we had more graduates, we could probably expect more jobs, but we're not getting as much out of our graduates as we might expect. So what's stopping that? If the software seems to be kind of mostly okay, what are the problems with the hardware of our cities, our transport infrastructure and their urban form? Well, if you look across G7 cities, you can broadly see that as cities become larger, they become denser. That the demands to locate in city centre locations to operate and access the benefits that cities offer mean that cities tend to build up. They share land more effectively, and they share infrastructure to access those urban benefits. And you can see that that's pretty consistent trends across different levels across the G7, with the exception of the UK. So while London is extremely dense, it's denser than, say, cities like Tokyo or Munich or indeed Toronto, kind of only really beaten by Paris and New York. Actually, if you look at the secondary cities here for the UK bar, they're all quite bunched quite closely together, all around kind of the 5,000 mark per square kilometer. So even though in other cities you see this kind of density gradient where cities become denser as they become larger, actually the urban form of a lot of large British cities is that they're basically big towns, right? They kind of keep the same low-rise, terraced, semi-detached urban form, as they expand outwards, and they don't become denser as they become larger. So there's this big density gap between between London and the second most dense city in the UK, which is Birmingham, which is also the least dense, second most dense city in all of the G7. Now you might be thinking, well, density, that can't matter that much. Lots of American and Canadian cities are less dense than UK cities, and they're much more productive, so that's not a big problem. However, North American cities are highly accessible to their city centres by car, right? Their entire urban form is built around motorways, around low-rise suburbia, and access to skyscrapers in their city centre with lots of knowledge-intensive work. Conversely, other G7 cities have urban forms that are which are denser and which manage the congestion that comes with that through greater levels of public transport accessibility. I've missed the chart, unfortunately. But basically, what happens with the Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds in particular is that they fall between the gaps between these two cities. So on the one hand, while North American cities are low-rise, highly accessible by car, European and Japanese cities, highly dense but highly accessible by public transport, UK cities are stuck in the middle. So they are too dense to be accessible by car, but also not dense enough to have high levels of accessibility by public transport. So they're cramped, but they're not particularly dense, and this reduces the size of their labour market and the number of people who can access their urban form. Now, one reason why the UK cities outside of London are not very dense is because we have an unusual planning system by the standards of the G7. So while every other G7 country has a form of zoning system, we have a discretionary case-by-case planning system that other centre cities work has shown as highly restrictive towards development and change in the urban environment in general. And you can see that if you look at on this chart the housing vacancy rate by at the national level by G7 country. You can see on the far right the UK has the lowest vacancy rate out of any country in the G7, even once you take into account things like holiday homes or second homes in that definition. So partly there's a story of the planning system being a problem because it restricts house building, it makes housing unaffordable, but there's kind of also this kind of not incidental kind of related problem, which is that it's a particular issue for economic growth because it's preventing densification alongside our transport network and alongside within our urban areas in particular. Conversely, kind of looking a bit more further at kind of, the operator side of our cities and how well they are doing, another area in which the UK is an outlier is it's exceptionally fiscally centralized. So while, shouldn't be a surprise that kind of the federal countries of Canada, the United States, and Germany all have more fiscal devolution than we do. Even Japan, France, and Italy all have considerably more fiscal devolution, more tax collected at the local level than the UK does. So only about 5% of all tax in the UK is collected by local government. That's council tax, and even that is arguably a very generous definition. This matters because if we want councils and local governments to have a strong incentive to pursue economic growth, then they need to be able to reap the rewards of growing their tax base, of having more funding to provide services through collecting taxes at the local level. If they receive grants from central government, that connection to the local economy is weakened, and they have much weaker incentives to pursue change and economic growth in their local area. But we're also not even just an outlier in terms of how centralized our funding system is. We're also an outlier in just how much of our local taxes we rely on property taxes to fund local government. So about 99%, I think maybe the remaining 1%, I think, is the congestion charge by this data. Of all local taxes in the UK are property taxes, which we know have problems for raising large amounts of revenue due to the effect on asset-rich, cash-poor members of society. Whereas every other G7 country has a much larger role for a range of local income taxes, local corporation taxes, local sales taxes, all in different amounts, right? It's not the case of some magic formula that every G7 country does. Germany relies much more on corporation taxes. The United States relies more on sales taxes. But crucially, they've all got this much broader tax base at the local level that gives their local governments a much stronger connection to the performance of their local economy, which means they have strong incentives to improve its performance and to attract jobs and investment into their local area. So again, the final instance in which kind of the UK is really an outlier is when we look at trends of investment across the G7 countries. So increasingly, there's this consensus that the UK's economic problems are caused by a lack of investment, primarily private investment, but often public investment is pointed to as an area where we're deficient after several decades of underinvestment. But again, a lot of this discussion about public investment misses the subnational element to investment and to economic policy making. And when you break out local versus central public investment, you can see that even though we're middle of the pack overall by investment standards in the G7, we're actually the joint highest, along with Japan, for levels of central government investment. But we're dragged down to the middle of the pack by having by far the lowest level of local public investment of any country within the G7. Now, perhaps there's a quantum issue here. Maybe, just the absolute total amount of investment by local government should increase. But there's probably also kind of a policy element here too, right? If central government is thinking about, what are the projects that are important and that matter to improving the national economy, maybe that's intercity rail, for instance. If local government doesn't have the resources, the incentives, the power to deliver on improvements to local transport, maybe perhaps a tram system in Leeds, for instance, then actually an imbalance in public investment where the central share is so large and the local share is so small is probably going to be linked in some way to the underperformance of large local economies. So that's kind of overview. I think it's pretty clear that the UK big cities really struggle compared to their G7 peers in terms of productivity. That's primarily because they struggle to attract in sufficient amounts of knowledge-intensive work, particularly services. And this really seems to be a problem, partly in terms of their software, in terms of their skills, but primarily in terms of their urban form, their transport infrastructure, and also the incentives of local government to drive change and to actually change their local economies. So, we've set out some recommendations, both in terms of strategy for national government, but also some policy recommendations on how to achieve that strategy over the longer term. So what we've said is that, to tackle this, national economic problem of being so far behind our peers in the G7, there should be a multi-parliament kind of cross-party commitment to become richer than Germany and lead the G7 alongside the United States. And this should be a foundation for national policymaking in general, and a way to unlock both higher living standards, but also more revenues for public services and for achieving other policy objectives. Similarly, to actually achieve this, policymakers need to recognize the role of the big cities in delivering over half, 82% if we include London as well, of that catch up. That's not to say there aren't things to do, on improving productivity outside of the big cities. If manufacturing is important outside of the big cities, more land for industrial space, cheaper energy prices would help. That can be a part of that story. But really, there is absolutely no way that we're going to catch up with the rest of the G7 without fixing the problems in our big cities. And the way to do this is really to think about how do we increase the number of graduates who can access their city centres within a reasonable commute. And that's going to require, big changes to the urban form of our cities, so both their city centres, but also their suburbs. It's going to require big changes to transport infrastructure, making their city centres more accessible for commuting, but also a big advance in devolution as well, especially fiscal in light of the local funding crisis. But just to kind of at the high level terms, in terms of policy, maybe get into some of the details of this in the questions. But we think kind of necessary steps to achieve that growth agenda are that we really do need planning reform to move to a G7 style zoning system. Obviously, planning reform is controversial in the UK. It's sometimes treated as this kind of scary idea that's really radical. We don't need to have the absolute best system in the whole G7. We just need to have a planning system that's normal by the standards of the G7. That can unlock some of those benefits in terms of increased development, but also increased density as well. Crucially, in terms of changing the urban form, we need much more kind of high quality, high rise offices in city centres that can deliver the jobs density that we know knowledge intensive work really requires, but also for that to be matched by improvements to the number of graduates that those kind of firms can recruit from. We're going to need densification around stations. So this kind of phenomenon you see where there's semi-detached and terraced houses immediately opposite stations, 10, 25 minutes from city centres is going to have to change. We're going to need to have reform of the greenbelt and other barriers to urban growth, whether that's things like conservation areas or, indeed rules around kind of height limits and protected views. We're going to have to take a look at these if we're serious about improving the performance of the national economy. In terms of the improving the incentives for local government, really the only way out of the local funding crisis that doesn't involve big increases to government grants or massive increases to council tax as in its current form is really through fiscal devolution and for introducing kind of a local income tax. There's other reforms we need to make as well to the structure of local governments to make this possible. But part of the reason for doing this isn't just to help get local services back on their feet. It's also to provide much stronger incentives for local governments to pursue local economic growth so that our big cities can play the role that they should be inside the national economy. And because, it would be kind of easy to say that, these kind of political things should happen without kind of a funding commitment. We really do think that part of the commitment by national government over the next kind of few parliaments should be kind of CHIPS Act scale investment or kind of, commitment on the scale of German reunification that really focuses on getting our city centres and our urban transport systems right. So we've kind of, if you look at various funding streams which have already been kind of determined but not allocated, about 2/3 of the 15.9 billion we've highlighted has already been agreed but not formally allocated as of yet. We think kind of the next government should go further in setting out that improving our city centres and improving our big cities is really important for the national economy. So that's all from me. I hope that was informative and interesting. Looking forward to your questions and a bit of discussion later with you all.
Great, brilliant. Thank you very much, Anthony. That was super helpful. Obviously, Anthony's done a sterling job in about 20 odd minutes of summarizing the report. The report, like all our others, is available on our website, centreforcities.org. You can get into all the detail, all the charts and the analysis and the implications. It'd be interesting to see what you think of that. We've just got a poll question we'd like to put to you in a moment or two. But before we do that, and it wouldn't be a Centre for Cities event if we just didn't very quickly get you to answer a definitional question. So just remind, you did say it, but you understandably went over it quickly. Just give a definition of what is the secondary city, what you need to be in order to be a secondary city in our analysis from a UK perspective, and where are we getting that data from? Because there's a comparability question. So just give us a reply on that, and then I'll ask colleagues to stick up the poll.
Yep, that's right. So I think it's helpful to think about looking at primarily at the 112 cities in the G7, defined by the OECD as functional urban areas that are larger, that are the size of Nottingham or larger. So that's obviously quite a lot in the US. That's quite a few in Japan, a bit less in France, Italy, and Germany. I think there's another one, and Canada. But we then take those cities, and within each country, we identify a primary city. So that is the city that contributes the most in total to GDP. So that's the largest city. That's normally kind of the capital. It's London, Paris, Tokyo. Or it's the largest city in terms of Toronto or New York or Milan in those three countries. The only exception is Germany, where Munich is a little bit smaller in terms of population than some of the other large cities in Germany. Every city in that 112, that's not one of those primary cities, is what we call a secondary city.
And the additional point, just to clarify as well, is because we're using the OECD definition around functional urban areas, that's internalizing some of the effects that you see through commuting, right? Is that, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. So these are quite large geographies, so a little bit larger than our normal primary urban area definition. The OECD produces quite a lot of data at that kind of commuting zone level. That is probably as close as you can get to kind of high quality comparable data between G7 countries. There were still a few gaps, so there's quite a lot of digging through national statistical websites to try and weld together comparable data for some of the more detailed bits. But nevertheless, kind of the definitions of the geographies are consistent throughout.
Yes, if you feel the sort of a hint of the pain that Andy was just when he was saying it was quite hard work to get the comparable data, it is simply a hint. It's much harder than you would expect, and what we'd ideally want. Anyway, that's an aside for another day. Can we bring up the poll? So you've heard what we've had to say about big cities and their contribution. Be interested in thoughts. We've got some questions we'll come back to in a second. But putting aside your own particular perspectives, we're in general election season. So we want to ask you this question. And again, it's a complicated question. There's lots of nuance, but nevertheless, yes and no is fine. For the next government, do you think improving the economic performance of the UK's big cities will be a priority? And what I mean by priorities, if you've got hundreds of priorities, you've got no priorities. So a relatively small number of things that really they're going to focus on. Do you think big cities are going to be in that hopefully relatively small list of priorities? Yes or no? Let's get the results. Let's see what our audience thinks. It's a split, man. 52-48. I've heard that somewhere before. Yeah. Okay, so 52 think yes, good on you. 48 think no. Disappointing, but there we go. 52-48. We're split on that. I suppose we should have asked an additional question. Do you think they should be rather than will it be? So maybe for another day. Okay, let's get rid of the poll, please. Right, and we're going to take these in no particular order. We've had some good questions coming in. I won't be able to do all of them, but I'll just rattle them off have a think about them. If I can help, I'll pitch in as well. So we've got a question. So the first question on the secondary cities was from Joseph. We've answered that. Alejandro's asked a question about the economic structure driving the differences between primary and secondary cities. He's suggesting that there's something going on with financial sector as a driver, and why you see more financial services in the primary city and less in the secondary. That's largely an explanatory issue. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we did a report, I think it was last year, looking at called Capital Losses, which is looking at the performance of London over the recent period since the financial crisis. And basically, what we found is that London's performance since the financial crisis has really struggled compared to the rest of the UK. So I think it accounts for over 2/5 of a total decline in productivity growth has come from lost productivity growth within London. And it seems to be quite broad based. It's not kind of purely a finance story. It's something more kind of fundamental about how London's economy is working. So, I think even if it's a case that, London has a strength in finance compared to other UK secondary cities, I think that's clearly true. I don't think it can quite explain, why London is so much more productive than the other secondary cities. I think there is something also fundamental within the other secondary cities that is explaining, why they're so far behind the line. I think if we'd maybe done this report back in 2006, 2007, we probably would have found that London was above the line in a number of instances. But you'll have noticed looking throughout the charts that even compared to the trend, London is underperforming on productivity as well. In terms of productivity, it's really about comparable to Detroit in this, across the entire G7. So there is room to be thinking that London's underperforming in some key respects too.
Yeah, and allied to that, we've got a couple of questions, and actually you touched on it in your report as well, in your presentation, which is looking at, we often focus on, and we do it, others do it, focus on the supply of skilled workers and how important that is, and it is important obviously to drive productivity, performance, economic growth, etc. It's not the whole story, and particularly the chart you showed where you showed high skilled workers and kids jobs tells us probably that in our secondary cities in particular, we've got some challenges on the demand side of the economy, which is basically the pull, the need for skills and skilled labor, and that's partly the problem as well. So it's how do we inject into the demand side of the economy the need for more skill, more talent? Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really the key question, right? I think it's difficult, right? There's maybe some elements on the supply side. Maybe we haven't got quite the right mix of skilled workers. Maybe kind of a lot of our skilled workers are kind of working in the public sector rather than the kind of knowledge intensive private sector. So maybe there's some kind of elements in which that chart, has some explanatory, variables. But I think kind of over the, over kind of the medium to long term increasing demand for skilled work in the secondary cities, some of that is going to be kind of national policy, right? It's making sure that the UK is an open, accessible market for people who want to buy knowledge intensive services from around the UK, from around the world, whether that's in Europe, our relationship with the European Union, maybe that's the United States, maybe that's Canada. But yeah, I think that's, we don't really touch on that closely, in this report directly, but I think there's going to be a role for both national policy there and local policy in helping support, knowledge intensive sectors, help them get customers and help them, sell both domestically and abroad too.
Yeah, and that's partly why, in the report and in our work more generally, we're thinking about, in some respects, we're thinking about transport policy, particularly at the local or the city scale, as a sort of labor market intervention as much as a transport intervention, right? Which is we're thinking about how we introduce transport systems that enable people to find the jobs that they want and desire, and equally the firms to find the workers that they need and desire. And in the paper you can see, and others have done it, you can basically either have a very car-based system, which is essentially not exclusively but very much a US story, or you can have more of a public transport system, which is more what we see in Japan and obviously in Europe, and we're kind of in betweens, right? We have a bit of car and a bit of public or a bit of non-car, but we need a bit more of us. So trying to think about transport as a labour market intervention as much as a transport intervention is the way we think about our work. So we don't see those two things as being separate, because they're both acting as enablers or inhibitors in actually trying to increase prosperity. And you can add something to that?
Yes, that's exactly right. So I deliberately didn't include an amazing chart on this, which is to try and get you all to click on the PDF and read the report after the talk is over. But that's exactly right. We fall in the middle. And I think I saw kind of one of the questions was asking, saying that there are real costs that come with the car-based model in the United States. We at Centre for Cities would agree with that. We think that those costs are real and significant, but we do think that nevertheless, it is really important to remember that the United States model does deliver high productivity, it does deliver high accessibility, and that's related in why the United States as a whole and their cities are more productive than ours. Conversely, these European and Japanese cities, they have high accessibility by public transport because they are denser. That is closely linked to the accessibility of the urban areas. More people live and work in reach of rapid public transport that can take them to their city centers in a reasonable commute. We're falling through the gaps, right? And people kind of say, oh, we just need kind of a public transport intervention. We just need a little bit of this. If you're not thinking as well about the built form and the urban environment that can support an enhanced level of public transport, you're not going to get the labor market benefits that seem to be really important for improving the performance of cities and the national economy.
Yeah, it's a great question. We've had quite a few questions, which we get pretty much every time we do a piece of work or we do an event now, which is in various ways. Richard Smart has put it more succinctly. Do you see the rise of remote work working against densification as a goal? And it's a kind of general sort of commentary about, well, everything's changed. People are working all over the place. Actually, the role of cities has fundamentally changed. Commuting has fundamentally changed. We need to recalibrate the way that we thought about everything. Give us a response on that. And
yeah, I mean, I think it's plausible that the sort of the distances people are prepared to commute have increased because they're commuting less often, right? I think that maybe means you've got a larger hinterland than you did before COVID. When a lot of this data is trying to be before COVID, try and be consistent. The data after COVID is quite patchy, so we didn't feel comfortable comparing against it. But nevertheless, I would say that it's, we're not seeing in, I think our lived experience over data that working from home means that cities have ceased to be important. It's just dissolved and people are like, moving out to the countryside just to work from home exclusively. We're still seeing that the benefits of cities as places of amenity, of consumption, of leisure, of education, all really important. The infrastructure is all there to enable people to do that. But crucially as well, not even just as kind of those things that attract people to certain cities, but we're still seeing that cities as labor markets are still really important, right? If you're a young graduate, you've just left university and you're, wanting to kind of build your career, to learn from your peers, to kind of build your own networks and and progress in that way. That's still the case. People are doing that by moving to cities, right? And they're still, coming into the office. They're still learning from their kind of more senior colleagues and their mentors. And that's, working from home is a substitute, for some types of work, either within the number of tasks that a worker might have, or indeed for a certain number of roles. But the experience we've seen since since COVID hasn't been that working from home has changed absolutely everything, and none of the the fundamental benefits that cities offer no longer apply. It might be harder now for the big cities outside of London to be able to attract in those kind of highly skilled workers. If the kind of amenity offer of places like Brighton or Margate or similar are more attractive now than they were before COVID. I think it's a bit of a challenge for places like Manchester and Liverpool, but it doesn't mean that sort of the fundamentals of what cities provide in the national economy no longer exists.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just a little plug for some work that we're currently doing that will be out at the very beginning of September. So we're doing some analysis and some survey work at the minute to compare sort of return to office dynamics, patterns, performance, trends, etc. And we're looking at Paris, London, New York, and probably Sydney, Singapore, and Toronto. So we'll have a kind of international perspective. All of those are obviously big superstar cities in some respect, but looking at the patterns of return to work and how that's been affected and how that is a changing over the very recent period. And we're talking to workers and to companies in those various cities. So if you're interested in this agenda, come back around the beginning of September, and we'll have something more to say specifically on the patterns in those sorts of places. And we've had a bunch of questions. Also, Carl Wright is an example of it, which is on your operator side, as it were. And Paul Connell asked a question via Twitter. Paul's question was, thinking about what does the 21st century institution look like that is going to help our second cities win, as he puts it in his tweet. So the shape of the institution that is going to matter for our secondary cities. Give us your thought on that, and then Carl's sort of sub question, which is about that local taxation question, and the way that cities get their revenues, as it were, from where, under what circumstances, and some of the ways that that's got to evolve. So do Paul Connell's sort of 21st century institution, what does it look like, and then go on to answer Carl's question on the taxation fiscal devo angle.
Well, I think there's two elements to Paul's question. I think one is that we need institutions that have changed alongside the national and the local economy. The last time we properly reformed local government was the 1970s, right? The economy we have now is fundamentally quite different to what we had back then. So it does need to change, I think, fundamentally to manage that. But also, I think the purpose of such an institution would be to drive change in the local economy, right? Just having kind of an institution that has lots of veto players, it's very sticky, it's, requires lots of consensus to kind of get anything done, I think is probably not the way to go if we're really serious about tackling this problem. I think what we need is more kind of a system which is relies on elected mandates, where if a mayor is elected on a platform for driving the economy, for growing the tax base, for getting more jobs in, that then should be enough to drive change within the state at the local level to allow the economy to change, to allow more private investment, allow more jobs to flow into the area. So I think the devolution agenda, kind of the next steps for the mayoral agenda, whether that's the Trailblazer deals, which is kind of currently being implemented, or indeed kind of our triple deal proposal for Greater Manchester, the West Midlands and London, kind of a shared devolution deal between those three places, I think is the sort of space we're thinking in, and we'd like to go further, beyond that, as the agenda advances. In terms of taxation, we do talk a little bit about it. So we don't really talk so much about things like hotel taxes, those smaller taxes, but we are quite clear that income tax really needs to be on the menu for the next phase of devolution. Partly that's going to be, I think, be an income tax sharing arrangement, to help provide a bit of a kind of a baseline for funding that's linked to local economies, across the country. But I think increasingly, I think we're the perspective that actually, alongside that, control over the rate and the allowance, a small slice of that is going to be really important for adjusting funding and levels of funding across different parts of England in particular, partly because the gaps are kind of currently so wide, and we do need a tax that's both fair, easy to collect, easily understandable, and indeed can provide that really strong incentive for economic growth that's buoyant, that sees tax revenues rise as the local economy increases. The other principle we'd say alongside that is the current structure of local government probably can't absorb a big increase in fiscal devolution because it's so fragmented. If you look at the United States, one of the problems they have is because their cities are so fragmented, you get these secessionary, very affluent communities withdrawing from the rest of their economy with really low need, setting really low taxes for themselves and dusting their hands off, whereas their poorer neighbors in a neighboring municipality have to have very high taxes just to keep the lights on. We really, really have to avoid that in the UK if we're serious about protecting local services. So our argument is an absolutely central principle of fiscal devolution is that as it involves less national redistribution, it has to be paired with more local redistribution as well. And that means fixing some of the geographies of our local governments. So we have the rich neighborhoods and the less affluent neighborhoods, all part of the same funding structure within their local economy.
Yeah, it's a great point. And again, a little plug. So we just did a podcast with James Tatum, who works for looking at the Detroit story over the last, well, over quite a long several decades, but particularly looking at what happened through the bankruptcy process, and then some of the emerging recovery that we've seen. And what was really interesting talking to him was the interplay between the property taxes in Detroit, obviously in a place where property was becoming increasingly less used, but also how the recovery was supported because they also have an income tax related levy. And actually, as jobs recovered and workers came back in, even though property taxation didn't grow, the income tax did grow, and that's supported and enabled the city to move forward as the revenues have become to expand. So the interplay between different taxation, all on the growth side, I think is really important. So if you're interested in that and you're more just generally interested in Detroit and where it is, have a search on our website for our podcast with James. It's particularly interesting, I think, given some of the perceptions that we often have of Detroit, which is really quite fascinating in that respect. So that's definitely worth having a look at as well. And the other point, just very, to bring it up, both main parties, both the Conservatives and, Labour, to the extent that they've talked about levelling up or whatever they're going to call it, and devolution, have both been very explicit that they want to fill in the map, as they call it. So England, the missing 50% in England is something that they've both been pretty vocal on. Our analysis, I think, and our position is that's all well and good, but you definitely can't do that at the expense of deepening and progressing the existing 50% with much of the big cities already. There are one or two that are missing, but many of our big cities are already into the devolution agenda, but it doesn't go far enough, and we need to take those places on to substantively deeper levels. And if you have choices, which is about governing, then we would think deepen the existing 50% rather than broaden to the missing 50%. If you can do both, happy days, but we need to be mindful about scarce resource in that sort of period. I don't know if you want to say anything on that, and
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. I think there is, I think the political imperative to give something to everyone is quite clear. I think we understand the logic of politicians when they offer that, when they talk about this. However, I think there is if you think about almost like kind of fruits from a tree, the easiest half have already been picked. And the remaining places that still have not agreed devolution deals on the voluntary basis, which is how it's been done up until this point, are places that for various reasons have been very resistant to devolution in its various forms. Some of those kind of conservative areas, sometimes it's more Labour councils, it's a bit of a mix. So basically there's a real risk that if devolution agenda focuses on this widening approach, a lot of time, a lot of political capital is spent agreeing quite thin devolution deals with places that aren't making up a big share of that gap between the UK and our leaders in the G7. I think ultimately it's going to be important that if we want to have a robust system of consistent local government across all of England, we're going to need to do widening and deepening eventually, both at the same time. But if the government isn't prepared to kind of basically enforce a settlement on local authorities and reorganize everything and redo the funding settlement as well, then I think it would be a big mistake to focus on widening at the expense of deepening. So devolution is kind of an economic strategy, something that should be led by Treasury to deliver on economic growth. I think really does need to retain that deepening, that big city element.
Yeah, very good. Maybe we'll finish on this, because otherwise we'll have given all the detail away and no one will read the report, which would be a shame given all the detail in it. So I encourage you to still have a look at the report and pore over it and come back to us with more comments and suggestions. But just maybe just finish on when we were looking at the way to think about what we were trying to do. We were interested in the reunification program in Germany. We've written lots about this. It's still hugely relevant, which is essentially about, how Germany deals with the East and West issues as reunification happens 1989, and the kind of deliberate policy which still survives to try and reconcile the quite stark standards of living differences that were evident on reunification. And that was, that is an inspiration, and we can learn from that. But we're also interested in the American example of the CHIPS Act, which you can look at, which is part of the big, very, very large Inflation Reduction Act program, which the Biden administration have introduced, which has many facets to it. But the CHIPS Act aspect that we're interested in is not just what it's spending money on, which is actually trying to make the US more self-sufficient in certain what they see as sensitive technologies, but also a very deliberate response to say, actually, we need to stimulate and support investment in secondary hubs, not just in the coastal superstar cities. And they've been very deliberate at thinking about how they then identify those sort of secondary hubs that can have the potential to grow and be significant in a national context as well as in a local context. So just say a little bit about, the inspiration. They're not models, they're not exact models, but they are inspirations, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And I think the kind of key thing for them is that they are, making choices, right? So they are setting priorities and deciding, right, we're going to deliver for these particular places because that's nationally significant, and that's where we're going to focus our national resources on helping those particular places. That's not saying that everywhere else it's sink or swim, but more it's a recognition, I think, partly that they have strong local institutions that can deliver for their own local economies on their own terms, right? So then if let's say if Omaha, Nebraska is one of the ones that hasn't been picked, actually the Nebraska state government, actually Omaha's municipal government can still do loads of things to try and improve their appeal to knowledge intensive work to expand their economy, to get more jobs into their area. But national government is directing its extra attentions elsewhere. I think the thing for us in the UK is because the UK is so centralized currently, national government really struggles to pick priorities because we don't have local institutions that can fight for their own corner and for their own local economy, over the medium to long run. So I think part of what we're saying is, yes, the national government should be prioritizing and picking big places and doubling down on their ability to attract in investment over the medium to long term. But actually, there's sort of a deeper thing here, which is if we get the devolution agenda right, actually the pressure on national governments to pick individual local economies and help them succeed should lessen once places have the ability to finance their own growth and drive it themselves.
Yes. An optimistic note upon which to finish. Thank you very much, and for answering the questions brilliantly, and also doing a fantastic presentation, and obviously writing the report with Paul. You can get it on the website. Please do have a look at it. Come back with comments and thoughts on it. But for now, that'll end today's event. Until we see you the next time, take care and stay safe.